Hey guys, this is the Forex price action trading course. This is lesson number 15, demonstration of basic price action analysis. Alright, let's get going. Okay, here's a lesson overview. So we're going to be doing a demonstration of basic price action analysis on the Aussie JPY pair. And we'll be using what we learned up until now, using trend lines, price patterns, and gaps to apply basic price action analysis. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is measure the native strength of the pivot in question. Okay, so in this demonstration, we'll be using this weekly pivot right here and measure the future short strength of it using the methods we learned up until now in this course. And furthermore, in this demonstration, we'll be using the monthly chart, the weekly chart, and the daily chart. So this demonstration on the Aussie Yen pair is going to assume that the trader applying basic price action analysis to this pivot right here uses the monthly, weekly, and daily charts to trade. Okay, so let's go on to number one. Okay, number one, trend lines. So find trend lines to gauge the future strength of a pivot. Remember to examine price action on the lower time frames at the pivot in question to fine-tune the future strength. Alright, so if we're looking for trend lines that apply future short strength to this weekly pivot here, the first thing we want to do is go to the higher time frames, in this case the monthly chart, because recall, the higher the time frames trend line, the stronger it is. Okay, let's go over to the monthly chart. Okay, let me just zoom out here. Alright, so that weekly pivot we're measuring the future short strength of is at this level right here. Now I already combed through this chart to see if there's any trend lines that come in contact with this pivot right here, and there are none on this monthly chart. So then what we want to do is go down to the weekly chart, because that's the next highest time frame we use. Alright, so on this weekly chart, we'll just zoom out. Alright, so on this weekly chart, I already drew out this trend line for you. Now the only legitimate trend line that's coming in contact with this pivot right here that we're trying to measure the future short strength of is this trend line from this pivot to this pivot right next to it. Now let's remember that trend lines can be drawn from side-by-side pivots, like in this case, where the wicks where the trend lines are attached are side-by-side. So let's not forget these. Okay, so let's see how much short strength this weekly trend line adds to this pivot right here. Okay, so this trend line has 1, 2, 3, and 4 touches right here. So this trend line has the bare minimum of touches required to be a legitimate trend line, and it's on the weekly chart. So let's say this trend line adds a future short strength of +5. Future short strength. Alright, so now let's go on the lower time frames to fine-tune the future short strength of this pivot right here. So we'll go over to the daily chart. Okay, so on this daily chart, that weekly pivot in question is right here at this daily pivot right here. Now, if you look at the candles forming right here, we have a hammer, doji, and an engulfing candle. Now, due to the sporadic nature of this and the candle patterns not being too clean, let's say this only adds a +1 future short strength to that weekly trend line. All right, so let's go back to the weekly chart. Okay, so on this weekly chart, we have this trend line, side-by-side pivots right here, which had a +5 future short strength on its own. And we gave it a +1 future short strength by fine-tuning and looking on the lower time frames to see the price action at this pivot, to see if it adds or subtracts strength from this weekly pivot. Okay, so in total, the future short strength of this pivot right here, just with trend lines, is a +6 future short strength. Okay, now let's go on to price patterns. Alright, price patterns. Okay, so find legitimate or fake price patterns to gauge the future strength of a pivot. Now remember to fine-tune the strength by examining whether the price pattern was legitimate or fake on the lower time frames. Okay. Alright, so on this weekly chart, let's go ahead and look for price patterns. And what immediately pops out is this double top right here. So let's just zoom in on it. Alright, so we're looking for the future short strength of this pivot right here on this weekly chart. And coincidentally, there's also a double top that formed there, with the first peak being right here. So let's go ahead and see if this double top is legitimate or fake. All right, so the second peak reached at least the first peak's wick high price level. Moreover, there was no close above that first peak's wick high price level. Now let's see if there's 10 candles in between these two pivots. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, so since a legitimate double top requires 10 candles in between the peaks, at this point we found that this weekly double top is a fake. Now, since we learned that if there's a fake double top, from the right peak stop loss level, which is right up here at this pivot high, right down to the projected target level, which is way down here, we learned there's consistent long strength added to each pivot between these two price levels. All right, so this double top actually adds long strength to this pivot right here that we're measuring the future short strength of. Okay, so this double top, say, adds a future long strength of plus 10 to this weekly pivot right here. All right, so now let's go on the lower time frames and see if the lower time frames price pattern adds or subtracts strength from this plus 10. Okay, so we'll go over to the daily chart. Okay, so on the daily chart, we can see that there's also a double top on this time frame also. It's right here and right here. So let's go ahead and see if this is legitimate or fake. Okay, so the second week's price reached at least the first peak's wick high price level. There was no close above this price level on the second peak. And there's obviously more than 10 candles between this peak and this peak. Okay, so let's go and see if it fulfills the last requirement of an opposing trend before the double top, which will be a long trend in this case. Okay, so let's go ahead and zoom out and bring price to the right side of the chart. Now that double top in question is right here. Now immediately we could see there are higher highs to the left side of that double top, which means the prior trend before this double top was actually down. But in order for this double top to be legitimate, we needed a long trend. So at this point, we found that this double top on the daily chart is also a fake. So in other words, even on this daily chart, there is added strength long due to this fake double top. So let's give that maybe a +2 future long strength. Okay, let's go back to the weekly chart. Okay, so we found that this weekly double top actually was a fake on this weekly chart, which added +10 future long strength to this pivot right here. And moreover, we found that the daily double top was also a fake, which adds another +2 future long strength to this pivot right here. So in total, if we're just using price patterns, the future short strength of this pivot is actually -12. All right, so now let's go ahead and look at the gaps. Okay, gaps. Find gaps to gauge the future strength of a pivot. Use the higher time frame gap levels as the main source of gap levels. All right? Okay, so again, I already drew out the gap levels on all three of these time frames. And on the weekly chart at this pivot we're measuring, there are no gaps. So let's go on to the monthly chart. Okay, so on the monthly chart, that pivot we're measuring on the weekly chart is right here. And you can see there was a monthly gap right on that level. So since this gap is about a normal size, however it is on the monthly chart, let's say it gives it about a +5 future short strength on that weekly pivot. Okay, so let's go back to the weekly chart. Okay, so that weekly pivot where we're measuring the future short strength was right here. And that monthly gap came into right around these levels right here. It applied a future short strength to this weekly pivot of +5 future short strength. All right, so let's go ahead and add up how much future short strength there was on this weekly pivot through all those price elements. Okay, so for the trend line, we had a +6 future short strength. And then for the double tops, we had a future long strength of +12. And finally, for the gaps, we had a future short strength of +5. All right, so let's go ahead and add up the future short strengths from this trend line and the gap. So that's a plus 11 future short strength. However, the double top actually applied long strength. So we're going to have to subtract 12 from this plus 11, which gives us a native future short strength of this weekly pivot of minus 1 future short strength. Okay, so we found the native short strength of this weekly pivot right here. But if you recall, in order to know the true future short strength of this pivot right here, we have to measure the prior opposing pivot's long strength. Then subtract this long strength from this short strength in order to know the true short strength of this pivot right here. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. All right, next slide. Okay, measure the strength of the prior opposing pivot. Okay, so we're basically going to repeat what we just did, but now we're going to do it for the prior pivot. Okay, so first we'll go through trend lines again. So find trend lines to gauge the future strength of the pivot. Remember, the higher time frame trend lines are innately stronger than the lower time frame trend lines. Okay. All right, so on this weekly chart, in order to know the true future short strength of this pivot right here, we're going to now find out the future long strength of the prior opposing pivot, which is right here. Okay, we'll start off with trend lines, so let's go over to the monthly chart. All right, so on this monthly chart, that prior pivot on the weekly chart is at this level right here. Now, I already done the trend line analysis for you, and there are no trend lines that come across that point on this monthly chart. So we'll just go over to the next highest time frame, which is the weekly chart. Okay, so on this weekly chart, there is a trend line at this pivot we're trying to measure. That trend line is right here from this pivot to this pivot right here. All right, so let's see how strong this is. Okay, so we have 1, 2, 3, and 4 touches, which is the bare minimum to be a legitimate trend line. So again, we're just going to give it a plus 5 future long strength. All right, so let's go on to see what happened in the lower time frames in this area to fine tune this long strength. So we'll go over to the daily chart. Okay, so on this daily chart, that weekly pivot in question is right here. Now you can see that these candles are very neutral. You can see that the size of this last short candle is pretty much the same size of the last long candle. So in this case, since the lower time frame's price action at this pivot is rather neutral, we will not add or subtract strength from that weekly trend line. Okay, so let's go back to the weekly chart. Okay, so this trend line on the weekly chart only added a plus 5 long strength to this pivot right here. All right, so let's go on to price patterns. All right, price patterns. Find legitimate or fake price patterns to gauge the future strength of a pivot. Moreover, if an earlier pivot had a legitimate or fake pattern and price still had not reached its target price level, strength is added or subtracted from the pivot in question. Okay. All right, so on this weekly chart, let me go ahead and zoom out real quick. So since we're measuring the future long strength of this pivot right here, hypothetically, if there was a legitimate double bottom right here, and since this double bottom is rather big, its height target level will be way up here at these levels right here. And since the pivot we're measuring right here is in between the hypothetical double bottom stop loss level right here and its projected target price level, if this were the case, we will add future long strength to this pivot because price is still in the midst of reaching that projected target level up here. Okay, so that's just one thing you want to be careful for. However, in this case, there is no double bottom or HNS here, so we will not be using price patterns to add future long strength to this weekly pivot. All right, so now let's go on to gaps. Okay, gaps. Find gaps to gauge the future strength of a pivot. Use the higher time frame gap levels as the main source of gap levels. Okay. All right, again on this weekly chart, I already analyzed price to see if there's any gaps at this pivot right here where we're measuring the future long strength for. So let's go ahead and check the monthly chart. Okay, so on this monthly chart, there was a gap at that weekly pivot we're measuring right here. All right, so this gap is slightly smaller than the previous gap we used up here. And since they're both on the monthly chart and all things remaining equal, since this gap is smaller than this gap right here, we'll give the future long strength from this monthly gap to be only +3 future long strength. Okay, so let's go back to the weekly chart. All right, so the future long strength of the prior opposing pivot right here, we found that the trend lines added a future long strength of +5. And there were no price patterns to be found, so that added nothing. Then finally, that monthly gap added a +3 future long strength. So in total, the future long strength of this pivot right here is +8 future long strength. Okay, so now that we know the future short strength of the pivot in question up here, and moreover the future long strength of the prior opposing pivot right here, let's go ahead and find a true future short strength of this pivot in question. Okay. All right, next slide. Okay, find true strength. So subtract the future long strength of the prior opposing pivot from the future short strength of the pivot in question to derive the true future short strength. All right, let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so on this weekly chart, the pivot in question was right here, and the future short strength of this pivot was actually -1. Then we found the future long strength of the prior opposing pivot right here was actually +8. So what we want to do is subtract this future long strength here from the future short strength, which gives us a true future short strength of -9 for this pivot in question. All right, so now that we've found that there was actually a -9 future short strength for this pivot right here, our basic price action analysis tells us a couple of things. The first and most obvious, it tells us the market bias between this pivot right here and the prior opposing pivot right here is long. So in other words, between these two price points right here and here, we should constantly be looking for long trades. And not just only that, it also tells us targets. So since we measured the future short strength of this pivot right here against the future long strength of this pivot right here, and we found that the future short strength of this pivot right here was -9, at a basic level, this should be a +9 worth of a move up beyond this point. So in other words, if you're trading and price falls down here, but knowing that we should be long biased, let's say we took an entry long at this point right here, our initial first target can be at this 0 line level right here, and the rest of the +9 future long strength can simply be extension targets. And moreover, and most importantly, it also gives us a stop loss level. So since we measured the future short strength of this pivot right here against this pivot right here, as price pulls back, let's say we take a long entry because we know we should be long biased at least up to this point right here, but we also know where price should not fall to, which is this pivot right here. Or in other words, this level right here could be your stop loss level. Because if price gets through this level, at that point, since we're basing our long bias on the relative strength of this pivot, and we found there is more strength long than short, if price does touch this pivot low price level right here, we'll know our calculation or our analysis was wrong. And thus that's why we will keep the stop loss level right here. Because it's a logical point in which we know our analysis was wrong. Okay, so let's go on to the remainder of that text. Okay, so keep in mind that although basic price action analysis can drive the basic market bias of a currency pair, it is only the foundational piece of the puzzle. In order to accurately gauge the market bias consistently, there are other factors involved, and these other factors are the subject of part 2 of this Forex price action trading course. All right, so let me explain this to you. All right, so what we learned in part 1 of this course is the foundations of how to read price. So through price characteristics, we found that from any given 2 points, say this level right here and this level right here, we learn how to basically find the market bias, whether long or short. On part 2 of this course, I'm going to teach you the other components that are necessary to consistently read the market bias. Now, example of this is like we did earlier, we found that we should be long biased between these 2 pivots. However, hypothetically, let's say price does reach this price level that we expected price not to reach. Now, this could be simply because our foundational analysis was wrong, but what is more likely is that the market bias changed in recent price action. Now, the most common way in that market biases change is a concept I use commonly in my forecast and analysis of compact price action. So compact price action implies a lot of strength in the direction it's headed. So in other words, if compact price action is downward, that's showing a lot of strength down. And if it's up like this, that's showing a lot of strength long. So this type of compact price action right here forms in between the price levels that we measure the future strength of. Let's say it forms in this area right here. Then this changes the market bias from long into short. So a logical way to look at this is that price changes every day, and reading price is an ongoing process. So in other words, although we measure the market bias of this pivot and this pivot right here, we don't know what's going to happen beyond that point. So if all things remain equal, price should reach at least this pivot high right here, according to our analysis. However, that analysis was based on the price action up to this point right here. So if price in the future decides to show a lot of short strength, as a price action trader, you have to change your market bias immediately. And so those changes in market bias and how to read them through price is the subject of part 2 of this Forex price action trading course. Okay. All right, let's go on to the next slide. All right, so congratulations. Hallelujah! At this point, if you've gone through my first course, you should now know the foundations of how to read price. Now, in part 2 of this course, like I explained earlier, we're going to learn how to read price at a more intricate level, which is going to further allow us as traders to consistently know the market bias. Okay, so if you have any questions about this lesson, like always, please leave it in the comments. And I hope you guys have a great rest of the day. And thanks for watching. Okay, bye.